Yet the media and the government keep telling us, oh, no, crime is coming down. What are you so worried about? Everything's fine. What's the truth here? Well, there's an organization, the Coalition for Law, Order, and Safety, that's been among the good people looking into this. Sean Kennedy is its executive director and joins us now. Sean, good to talk to you, sir.
Well, thank you for having me, Vince. I'm glad to be here.
So square this for us. I do keep hearing from places like the White House and various mayors, Democrats all, that, oh, no, crime is coming down. Don't you worry so much about the crime. What's actually going on?
Well, since 2020, since really May 2020, crime, particularly violence, skyrocketed. There's lots of reasons that we discussed before in the report: deprosecution, decarceration, that is emptying out the prisons, the politicization of crime and justice in America, and obviously depolicing. And all of those contributed to a huge spike in actual violent crime. And then that rise in homicides reached 40% over the combined over 2021 and 2022, or 2020, 2021. And then it declined slightly in the last year, according to the FBI, and then declined further in the last year. But we dug into the numbers, and what was so striking was the FBI isn't wholly reporting most jurisdictions' data. The data is like Swiss cheese. And so they're guessing what should be the number of homicides in a given year in a jurisdiction, and then extrapolating from that the national decline in murders or aggravated assaults or robberies. And some of the numbers are just plain wrong. They get the number for the number of robberies in Milwaukee wrong. They get the number of homicides in Baltimore wrong. And these numbers are publicly available from the police themselves.
So does that mean,
FBI,
so like in Milwaukee and Baltimore, just to use those examples specifically, is the crime higher than the FBI indicates?
Absolutely. Every single category in the last year that we saw comparing the city-level agency data to FBI reported data in this latest quarterly estimate, which is what the Biden administration is touting, it turns out almost every single one of those data points undercounted this year's data and overcounted last year's, or counted correctly last year's according to the police data. So basically they're using a baseline that shows a steeper drop than it really is. If they were using two bad baselines, you'd say, okay, well, it's just a math mistake. But conveniently, every single time, they undercount this last year's data and overcount or correctly count the previous year's. So you get these massive drops that don't exist.
This is a familiar trick, by the way, for the Biden administration. They've done this in any number of subject areas. One of them is, say, inflation. They say, well, inflation's coming down from its high. Well, the high was achieved during Biden. That's when, so the worst has been during Biden. The gas prices are coming down. Yeah, from the high achieved during Biden. They make these ridiculous claims that, oh, things are improving. Yeah, you're the one on whose watch it was made so much worse. And here you've got kind of a manipulation of the data where they're trying to take credit for an improving picture that they're comparing against themselves. They set the awful record, and they're not actually even telling us the full truth, are they?
No, and even if you take their numbers at face value, which we point out in the report, there's huge errors. So many departments. San Francisco won't even report its data to the FBI until 2025 because they introduced this new system, which is sort of at the root of a lot of these problems that is too onerous for them to comply with. San Francisco isn't even reporting data to the FBI. But you can go to the San Francisco police website and get all their data right now. You can't just Google San Francisco police crime statistics,
right,
and they'll show you how many murders there were. But the FBI has no idea. And the way I analogize this, I think that's the kind of, it works with inflation and works with unemployment and works with all these other things, is you took us to the top of Mount Everest, and now we're at K2, the mountain next to Mount Everest, which is slightly lower, and telling us we're so much closer to the ground. I mean, that's true, but it's not really true.
And you don't get credit
for that.
You're
closer to the ground. Yeah, you don't get credit for that. I mean, that's sort of the problem here is if we're not using the right yardstick, if we're not measuring things correctly, we can't solve the problem.
No, not at all. Now, another piece here that I think matters is how often do we record crime at all in all of these jurisdictions? So you've got Democrat cities where you have Democrat prosecutors who are refusing to prosecute broad categories of crime. you can't say that the crime itself is down, but what you can say is the enforcement of the law certainly is.
Absolutely. And I'll use a simple and tangible example to people here in the Washington, D.C. area. Almost every jurisdiction around here has raised what we call the felony theft threshold, which is the amount of money something has to cost for you to steal it and it to be a felony, which would constitute a larceny theft under the FBI's definition of a property crime. Well, if you make that threshold, like they have in Virginia, go from $200 to $1,000, a $700 laptop is no longer a felony. And therefore, did it happen? If the police say it's a petty theft, it's a minor crime, we're not going to record it, call your insurance, and they don't record it, it didn't happen, so there was no shoplifting. That's effectively what can be happening here. And we know in previous jurisdictions, in other places in Los Angeles and elsewhere, they've caught the cops red-handed manipulating the crime stats in just that way to make their bosses look better.
Yes, and then they come along and they're like, "Hey, crime is down." Actually, no, enforcement of the law is down. In fact, our friend here, John Lott, over at the Crime Prevention Research Center, he just put out a survey. It comes out at a great time. You both have these great reports coming out. His is talking about arrest rates have plummeted, and therefore people have been less willing to report crime. So if the cops aren't even arresting people because the left is stopping that from happening, then people think, why am I going to pick up the phone to dial 911 to even make the call? I know how this ends, and it's not going to be good for me. If a criminal, comes after me for calling 911 and nobody's actually going to lock up the criminal, that's a bad story for me. So this is a vicious cycle.
This can be very, very dangerous. We like to think about the idea of robbery and stranger rape and all these kind of crimes where they're, Law and Order SVU style, terrible, dramatized things. But most people who are robbed by other people in their neighborhood or people they know, or people who are abused or are abused by other people they know. And their unwillingness to report results in two things: further victimization of the victim, because now the victim knows the perpetrator knows they're an easy target, or alternatively, which is what the victim survey that John Lott, who does great research, is studying in that victim survey by the Bureau of Justice Statistics, which is also under the Justice Department, that survey points out that people say they're going to handle the problem themselves. And that's especially the case for robbery. What does that mean? They're going to handle the problem themselves by not reporting it. They're going to deal with it. That is a recipe for lawlessness.
Well, sure. And that person may then commit some sort of crime back at the person who robbed them.
Retaliate. And we know in many of these jurisdictions that a number of the homicides are actually retaliations. They're retaliations for other crimes or for offenses or whatever reason. So we're creating more crime by not prosecuting the first crime or not even taking the report in the first place, because the victim feels like they have to take the law into their own hands.
Well, that kind of lawlessness is historically a breeding ground for gang activity and warlords and all sorts of awful outcomes that don't bring stability and peace to a community, instead bring chaos to it.
Absolutely. I mean, we know that anytime you create a culture where the authorities, there's no neutral arbiter, there's no justice, the justice of a one man trumps the justice of everyone else. And then you get into exactly that, the cycles of violence, the Hatfields and the McCoys, all this kind of gang violence, third world warlords, where people are committing their own crimes in order to avenge previous crimes. And it just starts to spiral out of control. And that's what we're asking for when there's no expectation that the people who are in charge of the justice system are doing their job. And that is what's shown in the other reports and other polls from Gallup and others, that the faith in the institutions of our justice system is at record lows right now. And the reason is because they don't trust the people to do their jobs. And in this case, unfortunately, we don't trust them to even account for how much crime there really is.
So if you were to do a survey of people who live in crime-ridden areas, historically crime-ridden areas, would you find that they think things are improving or things are a lot worse right now?
We know that they think it's worse. They're less safe than they were. They feel less safe. They feel less able and willing and trustworthy of the police. And that's sort of the interesting sort of rub here, is the left likes to say, oh, people don't trust the police because they're racist or they're terrible. But at the same time, even if we improve the police sort of, malfeasance issues, abuse of force or whatever else, but they don't trust that the police will protect them, they're not going to have trust. So it's a chicken or the egg question. Is it that they don't trust them to do their job and protect them, or is it that they think their police are going to do something bad to them personally? Either way, there's a breakdown in our justice system that needs to be fixed, and lying about the data isn't helping anyone get there.
And this idea that most cops or even half of them are somehow abusive is a lie. It's a total canard. But what the reality here is that you have cops who are making arrests, and then that guy's back on the street because doesn't have a system that supports that arrest to begin with. So as a result, people are thinking, wait, why am I going to call the cops? The guy's just going to be released in no time, even if the cop does his job perfectly.
It's absolute demoralization trickle down. At every juncture, somebody says, oh, we're not going to bother following through on that. So then eventually it gets down to the victim, and they find out that the cops aren't going to pursue it. But the cop is demoralized because they just arrested the guy because the prosecutor didn't prosecute. And the prosecutor didn't prosecute because they changed the laws that made the laws more lenient, so it wasn't worth it, and so forth and so on. And then people at the top, like the White House or governors or whatever, are like, I don't understand why these cops aren't just, locking up the criminals and getting all the bad guys off the street, even though we took away all their tools. And I don't understand. And this is the funny part, of course, is the media saying, I can't believe all these people are lying. They're so wrong. That was the kicker, was back in December, the third quarter report came out, and NBC News had the gall to say, the American people think crime is rising. They're wrong. And that was the headline. Like, they're wrong. It's not, here's what's going on or whatever. No, they're wrong. They're stupid. You cannot have an opinion that differs from this statistic that we, of course, aren't going to ask tough questions about because the American people are just stupid. They have to believe what we tell them fits the narrative.
So when I see headlines that say that crime is down, and I see it all the time, these lefty outlets have been running all these headlines for months now in the lead up to the election. They say crime is down, crime is down. You're telling me, Sean Kennedy, this is a hoax.
It's not that it's a hoax. Crime may well be down relative to where it was, but crime is demonstrably up from before George Floyd.
Yeah.
But here's an important point about the crime narrative and how this fits in the timeline. Google FBI crime statistics airs and put your Google search settings to 2021, 2022. CNN, MSNBC, they will all have articles criticizing the FBI's crime data. Go forward, they will all now have data stories praising the FBI and praising the great data they produce. What changed? The FBI data is no better. In a way, it may be worse than it was even a few years ago. But what changed was the answer they got from the FBI data machine was the answer they wanted.
Right. So they claimed the FBI was covering up criminality before when it served some sort of political purpose. Now they're
in this case, it was that crime was rising in 2021, and that hurt Biden. And when it hurts Biden, then the FBI data is wrong. We can't trust these numbers or whatever. And now that it's declining, if anyone throws cold water on the FBI crime statistics, oh, you're wrong. You have to trust the FBI. PolitiFact has a story out today saying, look at all these great FBI numbers. They prove that crime isn't skyrocketing. And I actually wrote a piece in the Washington Post in 2016 with Trump throwing cold water on PolitiFact's fact check of Trump, saying Trump had said crime was rising in 2016.
Yeah.
And it turns out he was right, and PolitiFact didn't understand how to read data. And I ended up with a Washington Post op-ed about this because it was so embarrassing that they're carrying water for whatever the narrative is. In this case, that the Obama administration had fought crime successfully, or the Ferguson effect didn't exist, or whatever. And now that it's in Biden's best interest, PolitiFact is out there, carrying the water once again, when in fact they should be throwing cold water all over these numbers and saying, hey, why do San Francisco and St. Louis and New Orleans, they just found out New Orleans last week, by the way, the rape numbers totally wrong. They just corrected 3 years of rape numbers. They were totally inaccurate. And they're going to fix that. So we'll make sure, we'll stay tuned that that'll be headlines on CNN and MSNBC later this week that all the data out of New Orleans or the data out of Kansas from last year or the data out of St. Louis from last year was all wrong, which we know from some of the local media, but nationally nobody ever questions the national data.
And they should. And here they are rigging data to influence elections. What do you call that? Sean Kennedy, over at the Coalition for Law, Order, and Safety. Sir, thank you for your time today and your excellent work.